But when you go to Kemet and you go to the walls, these are the Asiatics. The Nubians, the Ethiopians clearly distinguish themselves from the Asiatics. Now let me show you something. Now this one right here is in Kemet. Now you mean to tell me that ain't the same man? That's the same man. Some more Asiatics. That's what they look like. The Egyptians and Nubians clearly distinguish themselves from Asiatics.
Alone among God's primates, he kills for sport, or lust, or greed. Yea, he will murder his brother to possess his brother's land. Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours.
I wanted to deal with our relationship with the people of the world and the fact that, friends, you have had no friends. When they discovered you, they began to prey on you. Now let's look at our relationship with Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East. For 3,000 years, our greatest enemies came from Western Asia. They were trying to avenge the fact that they were once African colonies. You read a book called When Egypt Ruled the East, and you get some of the basic information on this. Now,
but famine from Western Asia is going to cause migrations from Western Asia. And a people is going to come in from Western Asia called Hebrews, later called Jews. Africans are going to feed them, save them from famine.
But this is off the walls of Kemet. Semitics coming into Egypt. And you can see what they doing. They messing with them damn goats. That's what they were. They were goat herders. So that's what they do. And that's the original right there. Kanoum Hotel. Showing them coming in. Messing with them damn goats and antelopes.
The first visitors to Africa came in the 1700s BC. These were the people who would later be called Hebrews. Now, black people are ticklish on this because black people think that everything in the Bible is true. I question the intelligence of anyone who thinks everything in the Bible is true or supposed to be true. It's allegory, stories told to illustrate a point at a time when there were very few people reading books. And most of what went into the making of the Bible was copied from Egyptian texts. Now, if you want to get so dewy-eyed over the Bible, which is a carbon copy of a carbon copy, why don't you go back and read the original Egyptian text? Then you see where all these stories started from. You see where the story of the Exodus started from. Now you get so dewy-eyed, you actually think there was an Exodus. These people walked into Africa. Why couldn't they walk out? Why did they have to go by sea? Let's get into this Western Asia. I'm saying that the people who came from Western Asia escaping famine did not have any Hebrew faith when they came into Africa. And there's no record of a Hebrew faith before theirs. Why is it that when they left Africa in the so-called Exodus, they had all three? African culture, an African religion, and an African language. Now look at the origin of the so-called people you now refer to as Jews. And you're mistaken using that reference because the word Jew is of European origin. And the people in Europe who call themselves by their name have no relationship to the biblical people of the Hebrew faith.
The Bible story of the Hebrew Jews begins with Abram, who was born north of Canaan in the town of Ur around 2055 BC. Abram married his beautiful sister Sarai and migrated to Egypt. There is not one shred of archaeological evidence for the existence of Moses or of any of the Bible's main cast of Hebrew characters, from Abraham to Jacob to Joseph to King David to King Solomon. There is, however, plenty of evidence for the existence of Egyptian pharaohs.
1680 BC, bunch of sheep herders going to invade Africa. called the Shepherd Kings later. The Hebrews that the Africans saved from famine, gave jobs to, befriended, instead of joining the Africans against the invaders from the east, they joined the invaders from the east, became collaborators and clerks for the new rulers of Egypt.
In the 17th century BC, the ancient kingdom of Egypt was suddenly overthrown.
They burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility.
The Hyksos, a Middle Eastern tribe who had settled among the Egyptians 100 years before, rose against their hosts. Exploiting the death of the pharaoh, they seized power. Egyptian nobles chafed under the Hyksos rule. They looked with scorn upon these intruders who dressed ostentatiously, spoke their language with a strange accent, and dishonored their gods.
1700 BCE, Hyksos ruled Egypt. This is when the Bedouin kings, shepherds, came up out of the country of Mauritania, which is right around where Syria is today, Lebanon. They came and they attacked Egypt. And they ruled in Egypt from 1700 BCE to around 1550 BCE.
This Hebrew migration into Egypt closely parallels Egyptian history when the Semitic Hyksos migrants overthrew the Egyptian pharaohs and seized the throne of Egypt. The Semitic Hyksos kings ruled Egypt for over 100 years.
These were the Asiatics that you see right here. Now, as I mentioned before, the Asiatics who came across the Sinai. So here we see the earliest recording of these people who came in and settled with us for a while, till they built in numbers, and then eventually attacking Egypt. This is again from Khnum-Hotep's tomb from the 12th dynastic period, right during the time of Amenhotep III.
In 1560 BC, Egypt was in crisis. For the first time in history, the kingdom of the ancient pyramid builders was now occupied and divided. Egypt was on the verge of extinction. In the north, a foreign king had invaded and declared himself Pharaoh. His people, the Hyksos, now occupied the rich Nile Delta. To the south, the warlike Nubian.
The invasion of the Hyksos to Egypt was really a shock, a surprise, because this is the first time that Egypt was completely invaded. This is the first time that a strange people entered in Egypt and lived for 150 years.
Jacob marries two of his girl cousins and fathers 12 sons. As Jacob ages, Joseph becomes his favorite son, and Dan becomes his venomous son. Jacob eventually takes his sons and his Hebrew clan and migrates from Canaan into Egypt.
Look down here, Jacob took his family to Egypt 1701. They don't tell you that they came into Egypt when Egypt had been attacked, that Jacob, the Hebrews, came out of the same area where the shepherd kings came from, and that's how they got privileges in Egypt.
And when Africa was invaded, 1675 BC, instead of joining the Africans who had been their beneficiary and saved them from starvation, they joined the enemies of Africa. No one has ever returned any favors to us. As a people, we have always been hospitable to strangers, mostly the wrong strangers.
The Egyptian people rebelled against these Semitic kings and pushed them into northern Egypt.
The Egyptian pharaoh vowed to reclaim his country. Out of the desert sprang an army of warriors, burning with vengeance. No Egyptian was more outraged than the pharaoh Kamose. Kamose did grapple with the Hyksos, but his wish was not fulfilled.
one local family was determined to revive Egypt's former glory. The king of Thebes and his two sons, the young princes Kamos and his brother Akhmos. The fate not only of their capital Thebes, but Egypt itself, lay in their hands.
Essentially, it was a time of great trial for the traditional ruling family of Egypt. There was a feeling that Egypt, as it had been known for the past 1,500 years, could cease to exist.
Kamos and Akhmos' hatred of the Hyksos was personal.
First trouble in Africa came from the Asians.
These are the people who enslaved our people. These people set up in an area of Kemet and Lower Kemet called Avaris, took over, and were enslaving the Africans for over 200 years until Second Enrei of the 17th dynasty, and it is he who waged war on the battlefield, and his life was lost on the battlefield, and it was his son Thutmose who continued the battle until his son Thutmose, who opened up the 18th dynasty. This is a real person, brothers and sisters, who said never again. He was the liberator, the emancipator, who kicked these Hyksos out of our land. This is the real historical account that we've got to start teaching our people, brothers and sisters.
Here you see Second Enrei, 1574 BC, gave his life to free Kemet from the Hyksos. Gave his life. And you see the damage that was done to his skull. He didn't give a damn. He didn't give a damn about the odds. He knew that the freedom of Kemet is not an option.
Their father tried to rebel against the invaders in the north. He paid a terrible price. 3,500 years later, his corpse still bears witness to his brutal slaughter at the hands of the enemy.
The face is grisly, partly because it wasn't well preserved, and there are many, many axe marks all over the head. It must have been a Hyksos struggle, and it must have been fairly bloody.
Traditionally, Egyptians viewed foreigners as primitive and barbaric. For young Kamos, the death of his father at the hands of the Hyksos must have been humiliating as well as tragic. But now northern Egypt, and even the pyramids, stood on land governed by foreigners.
This was the worst thing to the mind of the Egyptian. The pyramid to Ahmos, to Amosi and Kamos was a kind of a reminder. Tell them we need the glory of Egypt to come back. And this gave them the power to unite, to defeat those strange people and dismiss them away from Egypt.
With his father dead, his land divided, Kamos was determined to defeat the Hyksos. His actual words have survived, carved on this large stone, a stela. Kamos bluntly states his intention to destroy the enemies to the north.
My aim is to liberate Egypt and crush the Asiatics.
But Kamos could not fight alone. He had to get his people behind him first. And as the stela records, most Thebans did not object to living in a divided Egypt. Akhmos, still only a young boy, watched from the sidelines as his brother Kamos prepared his army for the fight.
Kamoze and his brother Ahmose would become the liberators, the freedom fighters. They would become the initiators of the greatest period of Egyptian history.
20-year-old Kamos set off leading his troops north into Hyksos territory. The Egyptian army now headed towards their ultimate goal, Avaris, the Hyksos capital. Kamos felt confident that victory was in his grasp.
He taunts the king of the Hyksos and shouts to him he's a coward, that he's no good, that he's going to vanquish him.
But Kamos would not sack Avaris. The records do not say what happened to him. But on the verge of expelling the Hyksos from Egypt, Kamos died. Egypt's hopes now rested on the shoulders of his 10-year-old brother, Akhmos. Although his mother had lost both her husband and eldest son to the Hyksos, she now groomed Akhmos to continue the war of liberation they had begun.
Ahmose would have been learning the ways of battle, and his mother and courtiers would have been training him to become a great military leader, and he had the example of Ahmose to follow. So he's got to get it right, not only for his own case, but because the nation depends on it.
Ahmose swore to drive the Hyksos out of Egypt, but he lacked the means. The power of the pharaohs rested on a small bodyguard. During wartime, this skeleton army was reinforced with conscripts, who were dismissed as soon as the war ended. From his exile in Thebes, the pharaoh Ahmose began to build a new institution in Egypt, a standing army 1,000 strong and growing by the day. Young men were eager to join the army, both to expel the Hyksos and to escape poverty. Success in battle offered the chance of reward. In his new life as a soldier, Akhmos learned the first rule of the military: obedience. He was issued a uniform, short linen kilt and light leather shield, and his hair was shorn to mark him as a soldier and forge a bond with his comrades. In the deserts around Thebes, out of sight of the Hyksos spies who plied the Nile, Akhmos was trained to exhaustion. Braced for a long campaign against an unbeaten adversary, the pharaoh Ahmose gathered his forces at Thebes. He aimed to attack the Hyksos in Avaris, their capital in the Nile Delta. Reaching the marshy delta near the Mediterranean, Akhmos and his comrades disembarked and marched upon the Hyksos strongholds around Avaris. As the Egyptian warriors assembled for battle.
After 10 years of preparation, Akhmos was ready to take on the Hyksos. It would be his greatest test. The consequences would determine the rest of Egyptian history. Akhmos returned victorious to Thebes. He presented his ceremonial axe to his mother as a symbol of his great victory. The work his father and brother had begun, he had finally completed.
He actually dismissed the Hyksos. His father and grandfather and his brother did start, but he's the one that he actually succeeded to expel the Hyksos away from Egypt.
Akhmos was no longer merely the king of Thebes. He was now pharaoh of a united Egypt.
The reunification of Egypt is crucial. It means a new beginning. It means that Egypt is back to where it should be, as a unified land under the rule of one king, one pharaoh.
It's a seminal moment. It's a beginning moment. There is sometime around maybe 1520 is the opening act in the new kingdom.
The Egyptians were so in awe of Akhmos's victory over the Hyksos that the pharaoh himself was worshipped as a god.
Ahmose, he was a hero. In the eyes of everyone, they were smiling, calling his name, building a chapel for him, asking God to protect him because he's God.
And then when our brothers come up out of the south, got strength to kick their ass out, then it said, then there was a pharaoh that knew not Joseph. They don't tell you the whole story though. They don't want to tell you. And this is a Christian publication. So if you get mad at them.
Now right here on these temples here, now you can see documented where we tied them up roped them and forced them out of our land. These are the people that we've always had problems with. The problem is we don't understand a historical war. It's a historical war with these people. It's an ancient historical war from the time we've had contact with them.
From the south, every time North Africa is in trouble, a king comes from southern Africa to rescue. Moses came up, kicked out the foreigners, and brought the Seti kings to power. And from the Setis would come the mighty 18th dynasty. Now that the foreigners are gone, the Africans looked around and saw the friends of the foreigners. So what you still doing here? Now, but the African in his customary generosity said that those of you who wish to obey African law may stay, though you betrayed me. Those who do not wish to obey African law will have to go. Those who decided they weren't going to obey African law left. Those who decided they would obey stayed. There was a 16-mile land bridge connecting Africa with Western Asia. So nobody had to leave by sea. What makes you think that a people have to leave Africa by the sea, pardon to let them out, when there was a 16-mile land bridge, they walked in, why can't they walk out? You need a dramatic, somebody needed a dramatic story to dramatize the myth of their slavery in Africa. When they were actually guests in Africa's home, Africa saved them from hunger. And when they associated themselves with the conquerors of Africa, the Africans said, now you got to go. Now they're going to dramatize and say they were slaves in Egypt. And anytime anybody said he was slaves in Egypt, ask them what period and under what administration. The period when they were supposed to be slaves was the period when Egypt was conquered from the Western Asia. If they were slaves at all, then I doubt this. They were slaves under foreign domination, and we are not to blame. People can accuse you of having them enslaved with one breath and say the Egyptians were white in the next breath. Now come on, get your lie together.
By 1500 BC, a peace agreement was reached between the Egyptians and the Semitic Hyksos, which allowed the Hyksos people to leave Egypt peaceably and move to Palestine and Jerusalem in the Egyptian-controlled land of Canaan.
And I'm saying that the people we now call Jews entered world history with that visit to Africa.
Yea, he will murder his brother to possess his brother's land. Let him not breed in great numbers, for he will make a desert of his home and yours.
Modern archaeologists have confirmed that the Hebrews were not a race of people as once thought. They were a Semitic and Asiatic class of foreign workers who migrated into Egypt from neighboring lands.
In history, Pharaoh Ahmose is most famous for expelling a foreign nation from Egypt around 1500 BCE. At the time, Egypt was ruled by a people that the ancients called Hyksos. Until recently, little was known about the Hyksos. Then, in the 1960s, their ancient capital, Avaris, was discovered north of Cairo. Egyptian history clearly states that the Hyksos who ruled mighty Avaris were Semites like the Israelites, and that they left on a mass exodus, known as the Hyksos expulsion.
We have in the Bible the story of the Semites leaving Egypt and going eastward from Egypt. At the same time, independent of the Bible, we have a story of the Hyksos being expelled from Egypt. I think definitely the two stories are related. They're describing the same event from different viewpoints.
If the Hyksos expulsion and the biblical Exodus are really one and the same event, then perhaps we can find the long sought-after proof for the biblical Exodus during the Hyksos period.
The Hyksos and the Hyksos expulsion is what we're talking about when we are talking about the Exodus.
All right. We know from the Bible that the Israelites arrived in Egypt some 200 years before their Exodus. 400 kilometers south of Avaris is the tomb at Beni Hassan. It dates to 1700 BCE. There is a perfectly preserved wall painting here that records an ancient migration into Egypt from the area of modern Israel. As in the Bible, the scene involves bearded Semites riding donkeys and bringing their families and flocks into Egypt. Like the biblical Israelites, they are wearing multicolored tunics. The hieroglyphic inscription on this wall calls these people the Amo. Looking in the right place, during the right time, we are the first to recognize a veritable snapshot of the migration of the biblical Israelites to Egypt.
Shun him. Drive him back into his jungle lair, for he is the harbinger of death.
You read the Bible, if you see all of the entrances of the Hebrews into Egypt, it was for famine. Look it up. Famine. Abraham coming to Egypt, famine. Joseph asked Pharaoh to allow his family, Israel and his 12 sons, to come into Egypt. You understand what I'm saying? Why? Famine. Famine. So that right there lets you know what this area was. God damn it, it was not. And so they knew if you could get anywhere down here near Egypt and shit, because this is where all the silk is piling up. This shit down here was lush. And so they would come down. And so the Egyptians, they really didn't give a fuck, They thought that, they hadn't really cultivated that shit too much. Because all of this shit up here was lush. And so they, this down here was like boggy and marshy type of shit. And so they left it alone. And then to the other motherfuckers, that's heaven. They don't mind. They want it. You know what I'm saying? They come down and they began to settle until colonies start popping up. Because the Africans really not seeing any type of threat from these motherfuckers. You know what I'm saying? And so by the time they started to, coming in with raids and shit, they started, harassing the Africans and shit. And then it came a point that they had to put an end to it. They had to put an end to it. And Narmer came down there, who was the first king of Egypt. And you could go Google the Narmer Palace, and you see him grabbing that Asian by the motherfucking head, and you see that mace up in the air, and he coming down in the smiting of the enemy. That's what that is. When you see Thor, when you see the Pharaoh with his mace, that's where they get Thor with the hammer. Memphis was underwater, where they built the first capital of Egypt. It was underwater. Narmer came down there, diverted the river, put an S in it, dammed it off, and when the water receded, that's where he built the first capital of Egypt, on that virgin land. So they always looked at the Nile as basically a swampish area. But you can see all the greenery that's even going into the Mediterranean. So that's why you got the Hyksos. They would come in here and they would try to get on this lower area down here because you can still get a lot of vegetation, as you can see. All of this was the best land. And so they would gather down here, get the crumbs, and then when they got unruly, we would have to come down there and bust their damn head because they lost their mind.
Every July, the Nile overflowed, making the desert bloom. Farmers had only to scatter their seeds on the rich silt left in the river's wake to reap 2 harvests a year. Hyksos held sway over this land.
You see Nama, and you see the mallet, and you see the catfish. Which one? Well, that's what Nama means, the fighting catfish. You see him with his apron on, you see him with his leopard tail, you see him with his mace. You see him with his flail, which represents sovereignty, okay? And you can see that he has slayed his enemy, which was the Asiatic, and had cut their damn heads off and put them between their legs, okay? And so the severing of heads is not something that just, the Arab was the one that felt that pain first. And he adopted the tactics. He adopted them tactics, them military tactics that we put on their ass. But when you go to Kemet and you go to the walls, these are the Asiatics. The Nubians, the Ethiopians clearly distinguished themselves from the Asiatics. Now let me show you something. Now this one right here is in Kemet. Now you mean to tell me that ain't the same man? That's the same man. Some more Asiatics. That's what they look like. The Egyptians and Nubians clearly distinguished themselves from Asiatics. Those who contend that the origin of the civilization of the Nile was from Asia should know that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history. Was from Asia should know that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history.
For 3,000 years, our greatest enemies came from Western Asia.
In the ideology of the Egyptians, the foreigner is the inherent enemy, the inherent inferior, over whom the Egyptians have been given divine power by the deities.
They are described as that vile foe. People who are beyond the pale. Foreigners are dirt under the feet of the Pharaoh.
Images of foreigners were carved on footstools like this, so Egyptians could show their superiority by literally trampling on them. Libyans, Asiatics, were depicted as ugly, as savages, not worthy of placing a foot on Egyptian sand.
Among Semitic people, herding is highly esteemed. The fact that shepherds and swineherds were the lowest strata of Egyptian society proves that they were not Semitic in origin. Exodus 8, that's 8:26 says, Egyptians would not eat with Hebrews because they were shepherds who sacrificed beasts that were an abomination to Egyptians. Now that speaks that in the Bible. It shows you that the Egyptians looked down on the Arabs, looked down on the Hebrews, because they were goat herders still at the time when the Egyptians were building pyramids. Arab or the Semitic or the Sumerian bring anything into Egypt, and at that late date they were still folding up tents, and the goddamn pyramids were already 3,000-4,000 years old. How the hell they gonna bring something into Egypt? The Hyksos. The Persian. They didn't bring nothing into Egypt. They destroyed all of the temples in Lower Egypt. That's why you don't see temples there. Those who contend that the origin of the civilization of the Nile was from Asia should know that under these Asiatics, Egypt entered in the darkest period of her history. And so when you look down the ancient walls of Kemet, you can see that's exactly who it is. Right now today. That's the Arab that was running up in Kemet in the ancient world, destroying our temples. That's who it is. They're gonna come in here and usurp our history. But when you go to Kemet and you go to the walls, these are the Asiatics. The Nubians, the Ethiopians clearly distinguish themselves from the Asiatics. Now let me show you something. Now this one right here is in Kemet. Now you mean to tell me that ain't the same man? That's the same man. Some more Asiatics. That's what they look like. The Egyptians and Nubians clearly distinguish themselves from Asiatics.